Hey Vaish.
Hey, Reg.
Welcome to Moral Mayhem. Today we have an interview with Garett Jones, who is a professor at George Mason University, and we mostly talk about immigration. We had talked a little bit about some of Garett's work in our earlier episode on immigration, and we were really excited to get to interview him today and had a great conversation. So Garett is an economics professor at George Mason University, and he's written three popular books, The Hive Mind, 10% Less Democracy, and the Culture Transplant, which is the focus of most of the discussion today. Without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy the interview as much as we did, and we'll get into it with Garett.
Hey, Garett. Thanks for joining us. We wanted to spend the majority of our time talking about the Culture Transplant, your latest book.
But thanks very much. Glad to. Yeah.
But I'd like to sort of kick things off by maybe talking a little bit about The Hive Mind, which is, I presume, your first book.
Yes, yeah. I got a copy of it right here. There we go.
Nice.
Showing our copy of Culture Transplant here.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The book points in the direction of how societies and cultures evolved to begin with, and while the Culture Transplant focuses on sort of how migrants change the countries they move to. So, but in the Hive Mind, you argue that national IQ, or median IQ of your nation, is a key and underrated driver of human welfare. So maybe a question to kick things off is, what are the specific ways in which national IQ might be more important in determining, outcomes than individual IQ, and what's broadly the evidence base for it?
Yeah, well, so the main point of Hive Mind is that being around smart people is more important than being smart yourself. So basically the idea that the economy is in some sense a team effort. So you could say, in a sense, this goes back to the first chapter of The Wealth of Nations, right? Your individual productivity as a pin maker matters much less than whether there's a well-organized team that can help the people making pins be hundreds, maybe thousands of times more productive than any one pin maker would be individually. But to make Adam Smith's pin factory work well, you need like a degree of management skill, right? You need people who, someone who organizes the task, who brings human mental capacity to organize the task in an intelligent way, right? And part of the story of Hive Mind is that there are a number of channels through which the intelligence of those around us can shape us. So a very simple one that I start off with, because it should be the least controversial, is that there's a lot of microeconomic evidence, a lot of psychological experimental evidence that people who do better on conventional IQ tests tend to be more patient. And if there's one thing that I've learned from being around Austrian economists, it's that the rate of time preference is really important for capital accumulation within a country, right? So people who value the future more relative to the present are more likely to save for the future and help build up the capital stock. We know from a lot of macro evidence that for poorly understood reasons, some capital tends to stick inside your country. It doesn't move globally throughout the world instantaneously to the most efficient place. Capital is a little bit sticky within a country. So being in a country where people have low rates of time preference, a high propensity to save, probably makes you richer because there's more capital around for you to use. So that's the simplest, and I think should be the least controversial Hive Mind channel. It's just the patience channel. Second, there's a variety of experimental evidence, which I was a part of and which some of my GMU colleagues helped me to work on, showing that smarter groups are more cooperative. One story that most people who study the social sciences at all learn about is something called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is a sort of tragedy, a sort of version of the tragedy of the commons, where two people might wish that the team could cooperate on a task, but each individual person feels like cheating and not putting in much effort. So you could think of this as every team project ever assigned in any college class. You could think of this as the problem of two roommates deciding how clean to keep the bathroom. Or you could think it about two political parties deciding whether to try to grow the national pie or trying to win short-term political gain by bragging about your party at the expense of the other, right? So all these ways, there's some kind of trade-off between individual incentives and group incentives.
And is your sort of intuition here, the intuition behind what might be going on under the hood, is that smart people can just like understand the game better and the payoffs better, or is it something more complicated, you think?
That's one purpose. One story is that having people who understand the rules of the game means that they're less likely to just be pressing buttons randomly on the dashboard of life, right? If you don't really know how the computer in front of you works, you just try pressing buttons to see what makes the lights move. Right?
Was this a repeated game? Because presumably this is also connected to time preference. Because if you do a repeated game, then you're
exactly. You got it. So it turns out there's only one study that looks at one-shot prisoner's dilemma games where the game is not repeated. There's only one that I know of, at least. I haven't checked in the last year or so. And this study found that smarter individuals are more likely to cheat, to betray, to stab somebody in the back when it's a one-shot game. But of all the experiments I know that look at repeated games, and myself and a couple of my GMU colleagues ran one of these, in all of the repeated games, when the pair of players are more intelligent, according to a regular IQ test, they're more likely to cooperate over the course of the game. They're more likely to, as I put it, think win-win. Mm-hmm. So people who are better at thinking are more likely to come to win-win outcomes when the game is repeated. So I think of this as there's something Machiavellian about this in the positive side of Machiavellianism, right? When you have two smart people playing a game against each other and they know it's a one-shot game, they figure out the rules and they know the incentives, betray. When it's a repeated game, the two smart players are more likely to figure out, hey, we can keep this truce, this social truce going, this social peace going. And rate of time preference is part of that, probably. I can't say there's good experimental evidence for that. It's sort of floating in the background. It can't meet the asterisk requirements of modern econometrics, but the common sense view that smarter people are more patient and more patient people are more likely to cooperate in repeated games, that's probably going on.
There's something paradoxical, right? And this is a bit of a digression, but I feel like there's something paradoxical about and this, it's not inconsistent, but it on the face of it seems paradoxical that you would have the higher IQ people that would rationally screw the other person over on a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, which means they're just rationally responding to incentives, and it's less about sort of like trust and more about responding rationally to incentives. But
yes.
like eventually that creates a society where people have internalized the norm of acting as if you trusted the other person. Does that make sense?
Exactly. I mean, but this is the magic of a lot of repeated games is that the tit for tat rule that we think of as so natural in repeated games, where if you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. But the reason I'm being nice to you now is because I know if I betray you, you're smart enough to punish me if and only if I betray you. Right?
Yeah.
It's basically society is a social piece that is held together by the threat of violence for betrayers. Mm-hmm. And notice how many ideas are packed in just that one sentence I said. Right? That takes a lot of cognition for people to think like, oh, these are the rules of the game. So when I discuss what I call the 3 Ps of the RPD, the 3 Ps of the repeated prisoner's dilemma, and the first of them is that smarter people are more patient on average. They're more perceptive. They understand the rules of the game, but also they start off more pleasant. So in the first round, smarter people, or sometimes in the second round, you see some tendency for early in the game for people who do better on IQ tests to sort of, in some sense, signal that they're playing by the rules, to signal that they're playing by some kind of rules of social decorum. So the 3 Ps of the RPD again, patient, pleasant, perceptive. And smarter people are probably likely to have all of them. At least they're going to have a couple of them.
And then the 4th P is that at some point, defectors have to get punished. Right.
That's actually a great one. And they know that there's punishment. They believe in the threat of punishment from the other person, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great one. I wasn't smart enough to come up with that. So
I was actually telling Regan something, like it's just extrapolating this to societal level things, right? I mean, we were both in India, and that's where my family's from. And a very trivial but clear example of this is like the problem of littering, right? I mean, it is a prisoner's dilemma in the sense that if you live in a place where that is the norm and no one gets punished for doing it, like there is no benefit to you not littering. Like the payoff is just insignificant. And so it becomes much clearer in those sort of like micro expressions that that's what's going on underneath.
Yeah, if you're the first person ever in town to litter, people are going to give you a dirty look, and you might feel bad about that. But if you're the 500th, it's like it's just the thing you do. Yeah.
So this might be a good segue into so just to sort of summarize. The Hive Mind makes the case that the national IQ and most of IQ's benefits are sort of positive externalities.
They're externalities. Like this is something that a lot of the fans of IQ on the internet, some of whom are very good people, the people I call IQ-colites, they don't like it when I point this out. But you guys will get the math here, right? That the IQ's return to individual wages are pretty low. So the number that I believe, based on some Jim Heckman research, is basically one IQ point predicts about 1% higher wages at the individual level. But IQ predicts about 6% higher GDP per person at the national level. So you can quibble about those numbers, but it looks like you're going from 1 to 6.
Wow. So one standard deviation even is like 15% IQ increase or income.
15%. Right? Yeah. So one standard deviation increase in IQ is like 15% increase in wages, that's nice, but it's not life changing for most of us, right? Mm-hmm. The most optimistic people just cherry picking the biggest numbers will get 2%. If you only just decide I'm only going to believe the biggest numbers, you can get to 2%. So one standard deviation increase will get you a 30% wage gap right there.
So can you drive the intuition behind this? So it's like some part of your positive contribution is maybe captured at the employer level, and then there's more captured at sort of like the coordination between companies level. Is that the way to think about it? Kind of but
also an institutional level, right? There's also I think that basically a lot of the way political institutions function is that they are forms of repeated prisoners' dilemmas. Maybe even coordination games, whether you want to think of one as one or the other. But basically, you're more likely to get good institutions like a Congress that's more cooperative, probably, focusing on the long run, doing some pie growing rather than just quibbling over pie slicing, when you've got smarter politicians at work. And then also I place a lot of weight on the Kaplan's research related to myth of the rational voter, that higher IQ people, smarter people by whatever measure, are more likely to hold pro-market views. So there's institutional effects at the micro level and institutional effects at the more elite aristocratic level, I think.
And the externality of IQ is sort of like one of the underlying reasons why people like Bryan Caplan are pro open borders, right? Like we want to bring in smart people because they have this positive externality. But yeah, go ahead.
I actually think he hasn't really said that, and that I haven't heard him say that. He's actually he does not make the argument that high IQ migration will increase institutional quality. It is worth noting, I don't know what his reasons are for pointing that out. He instead tends to emphasize that institutions are non-responsive to new citizens moving in, partly due to low rates of voting, perhaps just institutional stickiness, some kind of vague rigidity. But it would mean. It is worth noting that if one accepted the view that high-skilled immigration could improve your institutions, it would be very difficult to reject the view that low IQ or lower human capital immigration would hurt institutions. It would be very hard to
is it so? Then maybe the Kaplan view is more that you just shouldn't prevent it's a positive sum transaction that you're preventing, and I mean
holding institutional quality constant, and he's convinced that one can, broadly speaking, hold institutional quality constant. I hold the view that institutions are endogenous to people, to be a little blunt about it, right? Institutions are endogenous to more or less the current people within a generation or two. I don't know quite how long that process takes. But we have a lot of evidence that institutions have responded in important ways when new voters have arrived. An evil example of this has made the media recently in research over the Confederate diaspora, when racist Southerners moved to the North and West after the Civil War. There's research showing that places where a lot of these bigots showed up, got worse institutions on average, right? So I think there's both good and evil examples of how new voters have changed institutions. Sometimes for good and sometimes for evil. So I think the view that we can treat institutions as exogenous to the current group of voters is not well evidenced.
Yeah. And so in the culture transplant, you talk about how a nation's SAT scores, which measure state continuity pre 1500, when they first started engaging in agriculture and the relative level of technology at that time, predict the a bunch of things we care about, basically, for most countries. Could you just talk a little bit about sort of the SAT scores and how you conclude that people matter more than places on a bunch of important metrics?
Yes. So here I'm really drawing on the research that two Brown economists kicked off, published first in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2010. Putterman and Weil did great work. What they did was they were the pioneers in this field, and they collected data on how long states had existed and more or less been continuous from ancient times until 1500, right? And they created a separate measure, and that was basically a 0 to 1 scale. And they created a separate measure of how many thousands of years it had been since that region of the world had settled agriculture. So S, states, A, agriculture. And then the third measure was created by Bill Easterly and his co-authors, Easterly, Komen, Easterly, and Gong. And that was, they actually looked at the level of technology, basically what fraction of the world's best technologies that existed in 1500 were being used in that place. And so the reason they're picking 1500, the reason Putterman and Weil are picking 1500, is that after 1500, the world ran a series of very evil experiments, moving populations from one place to another, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes violently. So economists, fortunately, are allowed to use the results of evil experiments to learn about the world. And these evil experiments run across the New World, especially, moved people from the old world to the New World. So we're basically holding, we're holding geography constant and we're changing the people. And that experiment taught us that the regions of the world that were most successful in 1500, not only are those places in the old world, the places that were most technologically progressive in 1500 are, roughly speaking, the most technologically progressive today, right? Western Europe, East Asia, and also some places in Southeast Asia that a lot of folks from China moved to. In the New World, the map is totally flipped, right? In the New World, the most prosperous places before 1500 were those close to the equator, right? So the great empires, the Incas, the Aztec, they were fairly close to the equator, right? So if you believed in a geographic determinism story, and you were only using data from before 1500, you'd be thinking, well, I guess Ecuador is going to be the richest place, right?
Yeah, the guns, germs, and steel hypothesis breaks down in some
yes.
ways. Right? Yeah.
And so basically, there's Daron Acemoglu refers to these nations that a lot of Europeans moved to as Neo-Europes. He has his own theory of what made these Neo-Europes more prosperous. But the Komen Easterly Gong tech history view is that people rather than places are the most important predictive factor. And to speak at just the most abstract level, the most highest level, everyone knows that the places the Europeans moved to wound up with European institutions, right? So, and it's been a tough fit in a lot of other places, right? And the places that have gotten frontier quality institutions like high ratings from libertarian orgs like Economic Freedom of the World and whatnot, generally, on average, tend to be places that have a lot of Western Europeans, East Asians, or places to which their ancestors migrated over the last 5 centuries. So Singapore, Hong Kong, right. Macau, Taiwan.
Picking up off of what you were talking about with the East Asian immigrants, I think in the book you talk about how both India and China have underperformed sort of what their SAT scores would have predicted.
Yeah,
and I was wondering, you focus on Chinese immigrants and all the countries that they've moved to and the effects that you see there. But I have 2 questions on that. So the first is, with Chinese immigrants, when they've moved to places and they've raised the average standard of living, they also, are typically in the higher income brackets within those countries. So are like ethnically native people also making more money than they would have been predicted to have been had Chinese immigrants not moved there as well? And then the second question is, do you see the same pattern with Indian immigrants, or a similar pattern to a lesser degree with Indian immigrants?
Both great questions. I should point out that really China is not much of an outlier when it comes to the tech history score, the T in SAT. Mm-hmm. So T is actually the best predictor of the three. When one looks online and sees people who attempt to criticize this line of research, which is called the deep roots line of research, they have a notable habit of leaving out the T in SAT. I'm not quite sure why that happens. I'm sure it's just an oversight. Neither India nor China would count as a real outlier by any normal statistical method when it comes to tech history. So partly because there's just a lot of variation across countries, right? There's just a lot of variability in the data. None of these things are explaining 100% or 99% of the data. I think if one looks at, say, human development indexes, I have little doubt. Well, let me pick the easy one first, right? Migrants from around the world are often try to go and become guest workers in Singapore, right? They often try to become guest workers in Hong Kong, right? Those are two places I can speak to quite accurately, and I'm sure there's large literatures on that. So those are easy cases right there. So that's a sign that people feel like there's a lot of money they can earn, where there's a lot of repeated guest worker repetition, where people go for 2 years and then go back home, go to their home country and then come back.
Maybe the Gulf countries
this is something
as well.
where people are informed. Beg pardon?
I was saying maybe the Gulf countries fall on that list too, right?
Yeah, the Gulf countries. Yeah. Now, the Gulf countries, of course, are making money the old-fashioned way. They're pulling it out of the ground, right? That's not really the kind of stuff.
Right, that's not driving their revenue. Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, we're usually interested in figuring out ways that, the collaboration of people voluntarily with resources as a small input. That's the core source of wealth.
So the Gulf countries are an example where the place actually might matter more than the people.
Yeah. It's a great example, right?
An example that proves,
yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's an exception that proves the rule, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then when one thinks of Malaysia, I'd be willing to. I actually should look this up. I mean, I should know a lot more about Malaysia than I do. I feel like I know more than the average person, but still not enough. But I have little doubt that one's going to find that, for example, levels of health, longevity, median years of education are going to be pretty high in a place like Malaysia relative to, say, Indonesia, which is geographically quite close by, but unfortunately does not have the benefit of a population that's about 30% of Chinese descent. So,
I mean, hopefully Malaysia continues to have that. I'm not so sure that if they keep treating their Chinese diaspora the way they do, right? Because I'm sure
you're right. Yes, it's really horrifying, right? This is a repeated human behavior that when people see somebody doing great, especially if it's what they think of as an identifiable minority, they want to bring down people who are doing great, right? They always come up with some excuse for why those people don't deserve it, or they took from me, or it's unfair. It's just a horrible human trait. Yeah.
Something that really exemplifies the thesis, or while Regan and I were talking about it, was if you want to make the case for people who matter more than the place, I mean, controversial as it may be, you look at Israel, right? I mean, a bunch of European Jews went to the desert, basically, and now the place looks a lot more like Europe than it does like most of the Middle East.
Interestingly, there of course Ashkenazi immigration has been really important, right? There are, of course, always Sephardim there for centuries, but interestingly, Israel is one of the cases where their migration to Israel actually lowered either the S or the A in the SAT scores, because Europe has pretty low agriculture scores because agriculture was late to show up.
Well, because the Middle East was the first societies.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So again, one sees critics of this deep roots literature saying, "Oh, well, if the deep roots literature was true, then we'd expect to see the Fertile Crescent be the richest place in the world." And I'm like, you guys know you're using the worst measure, right? So basically, 1500 is really the time frame, right?
So the T is the most predictive, but the SAT together, you get a lower error if you use SAT scores. But for any, right? Go ahead.
No. Actually, it's been a long time since I've run it, but what I think is the right thing to do is to just let the data speak. And if you let the data speak, if you just run it as a multivariate regression, T does all the power. T is where the action is. So I did in the appendix to my book, I give a simple average of the three, S, A, and T, like, standardized. And then I do basically a OLS weighted version of that. And the T is just the story, right? S and A have a little contributing effect. But if somebody asks me, like, which one are you going to use? I'm like, it's going to be the T.
And I mean, it's not, you talk about this in the book too, but it's not surprising because it's intuitive that the S and the A would predict the T as a 1500. And then that would be encapsulating some of that information plus more updated information, basically.
Yes. And Putterman and Weil pointed this out in their 2010 paper because, as you know, in econ, like often papers are floating around as working papers at the same time. So they ran some simple tests using an early version of the tech history score, the T, and ran it along with some tests along with their S and the A. And they basically gave the story that I use, right? So I'm just, paraphrasing them. When they have their explanation, if you think that these cultural traits that are important for prosperity, if you want to think of them as culture, which I think that's the best framework at this point. If you think of it as something that changes over centuries, like it evolves slowly over centuries, then that would help you understand why S and A predict the T and why T embodies sort of the greatest hits of S and A.
Yeah. So the claim with the SAT scores that you could think of SAT scores as like sort of part of your cultural identity or preferences that you bring with you into the new country you're migrating into. I guess one question that popped in my head when we were reading the books was how much of this effect is controlled for national IQ of individual IQ of the migrants themselves, right? So like, do you still see strong enough cultural effects, or do you see like a higher savings rate if you adjusting for IQ of the immigrant population in a particular country? So for example, if let's say for some reason you only had like high IQ people from Croatia or something. I don't know why I'm picking a hypothetical example, but in the US and Croatia didn't have great SAT scores, but you were just able to skim like the top, and that's just some selection effect. Would you expect the persistence of cultural attributes to differ very much from like other lower IQ diasporas of Croatia?
Yes, right. So all immigration, almost all immigration is selective on some level, right? And especially, with voluntary migration that we've been mercifully been able to experience for most of the last 2 centuries, last century and a half at least. That means that there's always something extra that you wish you could control for, right? And part of the reason, for instance, why Hive Mind doesn't cover this question of multi-generational immigration-based effects of IQ on national prosperity is because I just don't, at the time and even today, I just don't believe the data. I don't have enough good data on the ex-ante test scores, no matter what test scores you're using, the ex-post test scores, the second-generation test scores. Whereas the beauty of a lot of the cultural transplant literature is that we actually, it's a version of looking under the lamppost for your keys, right? Even if you lost them somewhere else. Because we have data where we can use the World Values Survey and say, I know the average views of patience or trust or views on the proper role of government in the home country, and I can compare that to second, third generation people in the new country. So we're always using just these imperfect proxies of the things we care about. And using whichever one you have that's working quite well and robustly across major changes is a way to get us further down the path of understanding the wealth of nations. So now I can return to this paper, Cultural Values and Productivity by Andreas Eck, which just came out in the journal Political Economy. It had been floating around for a while. What they say is, again, they're looking, since you may be cutting this back in from earlier, they're looking at immigrants to Sweden who've come from many different countries. And what they do here, the first sentence in the paper says they estimate differences in human capital as country of origin specific labor productivity terms. So they're basically looking at a a culture transplant, but just for labor productivity, just for wages, right? And it's based on the country you came from. So it's very reductionistic, right? What the author looks at is standardized test scores in the home country and values in the home country. And the author says, first of all, estimated human capital varies by a factor of around 3 between the 90th and 10th percentile. So that's a big difference, right? That's going to be a sizable wage factor no matter what math somebody's doing in the background, right? So people from some countries are earning probably 1.5, 2 times as much as people from other countries into the second generation, probably. When I investigate which country of origin characteristics matter, this gets a little bit at your question, not quite, where they're doing a horse race between test scores and cultural values back in the home country. Cultural values are the only robust predictor. Now, that could be data problems. It could be, who knows?
Do you mean cultural values at the individual level, how much they hold on to those cultural values, or at the national level, the cultural traits predict performance?
It's looking at the national value, what the cultural traits predict. So we're not getting the sort of the thing that you would love to have, which is the test score, your individual IQ score, for instance, your individual math, PISA, GRE score, whatever it is. As a predictor of wages. And I'm sure those would do great in a regression, right?
I feel like also the reason we're asking this question, I don't claim to speak for Reagan, but I think this is right, is that we have this very strong intuition that, why wouldn't the hive mind sort of like IQ as prisoner's dilemma thesis translate over into like high IQ people going to a new setting and trying to play cooperative games with the population there, right? And that's sort of like, I think for me, the biggest sort of mechanistic question that I have.
You're right. That should be there. Part of what I'm going to be curious about is to what extent would that, if you bring in, high human capital immigrants by whatever measure, to what extent should I believe that persists into the second and third and fourth generations in a new country? And I need to know that, right, to say something concrete. And I was never sold enough on the data to be sure of my answers. Whereas with these cultural values measures, it's much easier for me to say something about the second, third, and fourth generation.
I mean, I would sort of predict that higher IQ people within the same diaspora or coming from the same country of origin tend to hold their cultural values in a looser way, and that actually is contributing to malleability or something like that. That's just my intuitive.
It's plausible, and it's at least plausible according to mainstream differential psychology, because one of the only personality trait that's reliably predicted by higher intelligence is openness to new experiences.
Oh, interesting.
So that might be, it's not like a 0.9 correlation. It's like 0.2, 0.3 maybe, but it's enough that people notice it, and it might show up in what you're thinking of as an adaptability to the new culture.
Yeah, because some of what you said about patience and savings rates and stuff points to IQ and conscientiousness being correlated in some way, because like those are sort of like subparts of conscientiousness in some way.
So interesting, right? Like it seems like this absolutely should be true, right? But it is not. There are hundreds of tests of whether intelligence and conscientiousness are positively correlated, and there's no correlation. None.
Wow, there's no correlation? That's not what I would guess.
But it does. Okay. So it's a reminder that conscientiousness must not be correlated with rate of time preference, or at least if it is, it's very weak, right? Or it could be that that IQ and conscientiousness are both different channels for predicting patience, right? They could just be completely independent contributors to patience.
Yeah. Basically, the test we use. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just saying maybe the tests we use to measure conscientiousness don't just capture the dimension of time preference for some methodological reason.
It might not. Yeah, you're right. Like that, it's funny. It's like I've read these papers for so long, and I can't point to and I've run these. I haven't seen a correlation, like a statistically significant correlation between conscientiousness, psychometric conscientiousness, a personality trait, and rate of time preference. Like it seems like I think somebody would have found it by now if it were there. So conscientious is like, do you feel like you got to do it?
Right. Which I wonder if it's like, maybe if you're smarter than average and things are easier for you, if that over time pushes against conscientiousness on average. I don't know.
Yeah, it could wear it down. Maybe there's a natural positive one, and then it gets worn out by like I can just fake it through this.
Right.
So it's possible.
But either way, I mean, the hive mind and just general understanding of how much value people can add would say, like, all else equal, if you're taking somebody from the same country, you'd probably prefer to select them based on intelligence and some other characteristics as well. And in the book, you talk about
at least it's plus factors, right? Yeah.
It's at least got to be a
plus factor. Yeah.
Whether to what extent you would have to sort of like raise the IQ bar from a country that didn't have a good SAT score to get the same like generational benefit 5 generations down the road as somebody who had slightly lower IQ or whatever. There's probably some hypothetical way of balancing those things.
This is what I want future grad students to work on, right? This is why you have to leave puzzles in your book so the future students will work on them and then they cite your book.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Sorry,
I just wanted to ask one question on, or one topic of which is diversity. So you talk about some types of diversity, which is like skill-based diversity, which tend to be positive, whereas values-based diversity is less positive for social cohesion and economic productivity and other things. But then you also say something about how, well, elites tend to really like diversity because if you get to skim off the top every time, then diversity is generally a good thing. And from the immigration perspective, the US is like the elite country where people want to immigrate to the most. And it just feels like such a waste that we're not using filtering mechanisms to bring in the most skilled people appropriately. It's just such
horrible,
a waste.
Right? It's been a huge failing for decades in the United States, right? Yeah, that we're not using 2 or 3 mediocre proxies for skill as a filter, or a strong, not filter, but as strong plus factors for immigration. I mean, we should never have full filters. You should always keep the door open for people in trouble. Yes, it's a huge loss to America, right? In our own field, right? I'm an academic economist, and I'm so glad that at least in the world of academia, we have a pretty good shot at hiring the best people in the world, right? So there are so many great economists who were born and raised in East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Western Europe, all around the world. And I know we're going to get 2/3 of them, right? And I can get to see them at conferences. I can hear them speak. It should just be effortless to do that in so many other fields. But you're right. This is a point I emphasize, is that once you can filter, once you can have a couple of levels of filtering, it's pretty obvious that the benefits of diversity are pretty large, right? And sometimes they show up in unusual places. One that I think to a lot of people might seem unusual is the fact that we know from corporate finance research that having some independent people on your board helps your corporation perform better. And people from different cultures are often just independent, right? They're not integrated into the old boys network, into the old networks of power. And so they might be the person who's on the board saying, what did it say on footnote 4 of that report? What are you guys burying there? They're willing to, outsiders might be more willing to deliver bad news, and that can help with corporate governance. So anyway, that's just one small example. And
in a similar way, it's like the degree to which you can filter. So whatever the optimal level of diversity would be without any filtering, if you just had on average took average people from everywhere, there's some non-zero but non 100% level of diversity that might be hypothetically optimal. And then to the degree that you can filter more and more, you'd expect that optimal level of diversity would increase. So perhaps it would be that the US, because of the way we're structured and because of the amount of filtering we could hypothetically do, should end up with a higher level of immigration than the average country. Does that sound plausible to you?
That sounds entirely plausible. And here, let me pontificate a second, point out that the point you made earlier that I make this distinction between skills diversity and narrowly constructed ethnic diversity per se, it's been really hard for the business literature to find evidence that ethnic diversity per se is a positive, right? Mm-hmm. To me, and whereas by contrast, it's easier to find evidence, pretty easy to find evidence that skill diversity helps teams work better, right? So I call that skill diversity Firefly diversity after the old TV show. A lot of these old, so on the old show Firefly, you have, a quirky engineer, a quirky pilot, a quirky, priest, and they all sort of work together on this project. And it really is a case where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts because they bring different skills. Mm-hmm. But if we just bring our cultural biases, that is more like just a recipe for conflict. And the literature on ethnic violence, on ethnic conflict is a sign that that's a real risk. This is a non-trivial risk. And the core benefit then, or a core benefit, I should say, of increasing ethnic diversity is because you're just getting a bigger pool to select from, right? Having a bigger pool of people that firms can hire from, that by itself is an unalloyed positive, right? So, and you just have to trade that off against this possible ethnic conflict, which shows up both within firms, between nations, within countries. But broadening the pool of selection, other things equal, a big plus.
So how has the cultural transplant and the thesis that underpins it changed your, at least, view on, presumably it's made you a little bit more cautious on some types of immigration, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think my question there is twofold. One, are there concrete ways in which, say, your policy recommendations, insofar as you have one, would differ from someone like Brian Kaplan's? Mm-hmm. And the second part of the question is, how do you look at the net effect of the like, let's assume that even high IQ people from the same country bring their, marginally negative cultural traits, right, with them, and there's no sort of dilution amongst higher income or higher IQ people of those cultural traits and their persistence. Now, how do you trade off like the benefits from the agglomeration of higher IQ people in cities like San Francisco or New York, and that spilling over to the rest of the world, and presumably degrading the quality of institutions over time? How should that impact policy? I'm assuming it's a complicated answer, but I thought.
Yeah, it is a complicated answer, right? And I should point out here that assimilation is always and everywhere a two-way street. So the idea that immigrants will come to your country and that they will do all the assimilating in the direction of the place they move to is obviously false. And this is something that many people overlook. I call this the spaghetti theory of cultural change, right? Italians move to America, other Americans start eating more spaghetti. This happens in many, many ways, too obvious to admit. Almost never gets tested. And so it means that when people run studies saying, hey, look, natives and so-called natives and immigrants are basically the same, well, that could just be because they met in the middle, right? Just like any good marriage, right? So keep that in mind when people are telling you that we ran a test of assimilation and there was assimilation. Mm-hmm. But second, I think that the message of the culture transplant applies most for the immigration policy of the world's most innovative countries. Perhaps we should be running open border style experiments in countries that aren't doing a lot of innovating, that aren't creating a lot of the world's patents and R&D, world-changing research. But there are just 7 countries in the world that create most of the world's new ideas. And we should find ways to improve institutions in those countries for the benefit of the entire rest of the planet. You can quibble about how you measure the 7, which you count, but these 7 by themselves certainly make up more than half. And it's the US, China, Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, the UK. And by multiple measures, that's where most of the ideas are coming from. So choosing immigration policies that are likely to enhance institutional quality there, whether using skill-based immigration measures or some crude measure of, say, current GDP per capita as a plus factor, these are all just ways to sort of try to ensure that not just that we don't hurt institutions in the world's most innovative countries, but that we maximize the quality of the institutions in these countries. So, as the folks at the Institute for Progress sometimes say, the United States is the R&D lab for the world, and we should act like it.
Yeah, and I
I
think this
think,
is a really
I
interesting
think
point
higher life.
also. Oh,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
Over time.
I was just going to say, I think this is a really interesting point also, because I think when people first hear your thesis, it comes across as nationalistic, that it's focused on how good are things going to be for sort of the receiving country of immigrants. But
Yeah.
this I-7 innovation leader point makes sort of a cosmopolitan case for why you might not want to be full open borders mode, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really worth thinking about, right? I mean, this is the way that Paul Romer's endogenous growth theory, I'd say, has influenced me, right? Once I started realizing, from being around all the economics of innovation people, from being down the hall from Alex Tabarrok, that like innovation spreads around the world, right? Only a tiny fraction of the benefits of innovation go to the person who invented, to the firm who invented it, or even the nation that invented it, right? People all around, we know this so obviously with COVID vaccines, right? So some folks in Western Europe, which included a lot of immigrants who's moved to Western Europe, some folks in the U.S., which include a lot of immigrants who moved to the U.S., those are the folks who built those vaccines in just a few months. So,
this might be connected to your other book, which we haven't touched on, is 10% Less Democracy. If all we were doing was guest worker permits, and Garett showing up the book, how much of your concern would be ameliorated if countries like the U.S. were basically just being very stringent about which I think, again, more is a problem in Europe, where it's a drain on the exchequer, certain types of immigration, because of the massive social welfare programs. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., let's say there was no way for immigrants to get naturalized or get citizenship and vote. Then does a major part of the mechanism for concern in the cultural transplant get ameliorated, or are there other sort of like social mechanisms too? It's not just voting, presumably, right? That on how people affect institutions.
Well, part of it is that there's the spaghetti theory of cultural change, right? Guest worker migrants who are here for, say, who were hypothetically in the U.S. for 2 or 3 generations, they're going to influence the other folks in their country quite naturally. Also, I think that we should just admit quite openly that the United States is never going to get rid of birthright citizenship. And so any child that a guest worker would have in the U.S. is going to be a citizen. And we know from the what I call the attitude migration literature that those attitudes migrate on average, to some degree, from the old country to the new country, get passed on to second, third, sometimes fourth generation. We just can't test a lot of this, but we know that second generation Italian Americans are kind of like Italians in Italy. So.
What's interesting to me about your thesis on assimilation is also that, in some ways we see some evolutionary pressure on ideas and culture as well, right? Like, so if you look at something, I was reading something about, top commanders in the IRGC in Iran, and apparently most of their kids are just like super westernized and have very deep ties to the West. And this is sort of like, it was like an encouraging thing for our kind of soft war with Iran. And it seems like, you look at countries like India, which again, the social conservatism has sort of like ceded way increasingly to a Western liberal outlook, at least in the cities, as people get richer. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering how you square sort of that selection pressure on ideas, if you will, with the thesis of the cultural transplant and assimilation. Where do you end up?
Yeah, people in other countries watching Taylor Swift does not raise productivity, right? People enjoy the fruits of the products from the world's rich countries. People across the world love watching South Korean dramas, right? But they're not imitating South Korean levels of productivity. So people from around the world enjoy the fruits of prosperity. They don't try to build those deep institutional roots of prosperity. It doesn't seem to be any kind of transmission to that, right? So depending on how you measure it, income inequality between countries at the country level really hasn't narrowed very much since, say, 1950 or 1960, right? So we're still at a ratio, the 90-10 ratio, the countries at the 90th percentile versus the country at the 10th percentile. That's a ratio of about 24 to 1, right? So that's a huge difference. Watching a lot of TikTok videos from people in rich countries doesn't seem to change this. So fruits rather than roots.
TikTok videos might make it worse, but that's another day.
Yeah, thinking about where productivity itself comes from, once you start thinking about like where does the productivity come from? Economists use this term, this magical thing called total factor productivity. And we can show that it explains most of the differences in income across countries. And when you start drilling down to say, what are the micro foundations of things, people in GMU orbit quite rightly quickly say something like institutions. Mm-hmm. But some of us should also remember that when Doug North first came up with the term institutions, he included culture in that definition. And part of what we've done over the last couple of decades, especially in the work of Alberto Alesina, the late Alberto Alesina and Paolo Giuliano, is say we need to separate institutions from culture. And we might find out that to a large extent, institutions are downstream of culture. And so if you believe that there is a culture transplant, even if it's to a moderate degree, then you should believe that there will be an institutional transplant.
But then I wonder if then the next other research project for a different type of student is what types of institutional checks and balances make them less likely to change as new people come in. I mean, I think the US has tried to, was built with an experiment that was trying to sort of do that as well as possible, but there's still limits on these things, obviously.
I mean, it may turn out that the only options are evil ones that I would never encourage, right? So, I mean, I've seen people say, well, Garett might be right about some of these channels. So what we'll do is we'll do this evil thing called having immigrants who are never allowed to vote and whose descendants are never allowed to vote. And that'll fix the problem. And I'm like, it's not going to work.
That sounds like where you want to live.
It's like, it involves a lot of evil. So, I mean, you might say like it's an evil worth accepting or whatever, because, being in a rich country is worth, but I don't even know if it's going to work. So yeah, it may turn out to be those things. Like if someone, maybe it'll turn out like totalitarian communism is the one institutional system that is robust, right? Like I'm not going to say I know that is the answer, right? But we start looking at very grim, non-humane stories, whereas really I think the right way to start is the classic public choice story, the median voter theorem. It's so powerful. It's not the whole story, but it's an important beginning point for any thoughts about how institutions change and develop over time.
Mm-hmm. I guess part of it could be like, I know you're 10% less democracy. The operative word is 10%, which is you still say that you want democracy at sort of the level that people can choose broadly what direction they want to go in and their values and goals. But like the way to get there should be largely technocratically determined, right? I mean, would you, I guess by extension, you would then be less worried about these cultural transplant effects in more technocratic countries where things are more top down than bottom up.
Right. So like Singapore could probably make this work, right? So Singapore could probably accomplish a bunch of the dreams of open borders activists, right? And they would do it through a lot of brutality, a lot of very rigorous enforcement of guest worker laws. It's difficult to imagine other countries pulling that off successfully. And so I think of myself as a reality-based thinker, an evidence-based thinker. And so if I think that if the only way a policy reform can work is through assuming the can opener of credible commitment, then I'm not going to go down that path.
Let me defend my previous country of residence for a bit.
Singapore, not India.
Yeah, Singapore. One way in which it's maybe you could even claim it. They're being thoughtful about this deep roots literature, because I think we've all heard of the housing. Do you guys know about the housing development blocks, which is like public housing in Singapore, and they have racial quotas, which is like each block you can't have more than 70% Chinese or 18%
that I've
Indians.
Heard of, yeah.
Right, and so it's to prevent sort of ghettoization, right? And that's one piece of it. The other less talked about piece is even when they're considering which employment pass holders to give a sort of permanent residence passes and then permanent residence to citizenship, they roughly try to keep the racial composition of the country the same. Right now, you could call it sort of like racial supremacist move, or you can look at it through that lens, or you can look at it through the lens of, well, something's worked here, and so toying with the foundations of sort of who built institutions in this country is just not a risk we're willing to take. We're not going to roll the dice there. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's actually driving their thinking, but given how rational they do tend to be on these things, I wouldn't put it past them.
Yeah, that's well worth thinking about, right? That like, how has Singapore pulled off their miracle, their economic development miracle? How much of it overlaps with traditional neoclassical economics? How much of it reflects a sort of brutal, at times, belief in the messages of the deep roots literature?
Yeah,
and then ask yourself, do we want other countries? Would one recommend that to other countries? So in 10% Less Democracy, I flat out say, like, something worked in Singapore, and if you just look at the normal lessons of political science, of political economy, of public choice, it's hard to recommend those to other countries, right? That low level of democracy in most other countries leads to some pretty bad outcomes. And so I'm glad it's worked for them. I think there are lessons the world can learn, but the idea of a wholesale imitation is, A, it's too far, and B, it's not credible to believe that other countries would pull it off with anything like their level of success in the narrow sense of GDP per person.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason that we talk about Singapore so much is because it does feel so surprising that they've pulled it off.
Exactly. I mean, and the one thing I'd be in favor of is paying all our top ministers $1 million a year.
Yeah, same. Is that so? I think you've said you would be pro allowing anyone who believes in Uber surge pricing to immigrate. So is this another one? Anyone who's pro paying $1 million to?
Yeah, exactly. If you're in favor of paying $1 million to Secretary of blank as an annual salary, that's worth it. Yeah. Plus guaranteed coverage of all the lawsuits that come out afterwards.
Right.
I mean, that's the reason why I think a lot of top people would.
It's sort of like sometimes you have this belief that we can, or Reagan said to me, or I said to you, that I bet on these like immigration selection things, I bet I could talk to some of these people for a minute and ask them a couple of questions that would be very telling. Now, I don't know if that's just sort of our overconfidence, but you could think of like questions that would be revealing.
Well, let me give a simple example that overlaps. Shane Frederick created something called the cognitive reflection test, which is sort of a 3-question IQ test that you might have run across before. I'm not going to repeat the questions here, but they're all quite simple. You can answer them in like 5 minutes, maybe. And it turns out that correlates like 0.5 or so with like a full-on IQ test or your SAT score, your normal SAT score. Like, it's crazy. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it is quite noteworthy how that sometimes short-form tests can have a lot of explanatory power. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I just wanted to say one more thing on the Singapore and 10% less democracy I just wanted to ask if this is how you interpret it. Like, the way I was thinking of the 10% less democracy thesis is sort of that you have to get really lucky with the oligarchs or whomever is leading in a system that's fully disconnected from the populace for the goals that they're trying to attain to stay linked to sort of how the median person is living over longer periods of time. So Singapore has done well with this for several decades, but we don't know yet like how many generations down the line that's going to continue to work. Whereas when you have some touch points with the common person, there's like a forcing mechanism to bring the elite decision makers at least somewhat in line with the outcomes that affect the average person.
Yes. I should point out that the extra possibility, it could be that Singapore has some kind of secret sauce, some kind of special like intercept term that just says their institutional quality is going to work out, and they can play around with the one ring of power and it won't corrupt them, right? the big risks that you can document from the literature of the risks of very low levels of democracy is, the two big ones are risk of famine and risk of the government killing its own citizens, right? Those are two like incontrovertible risks, and countries that are pretty high on levels of democracy, essentially as currently measured, have very little chance of a famine, very little chance of massacres. And those are both cases where it's the government making some kind of decision, right? And it could hurt a whole lot of people, but not enough people so that most people would just overthrow the thing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this is really these kind of wanton disregard for substantial but non-majority portions of the population is what you're running a risk of without democracy.
You would think that actually even in autocracies, as you point out on some other issues, like you would think that there's enough of a transmission mechanism, or just like fear of getting lynched, or fear of sort of like the public turning against you, to prevent things like famines, but apparently not, right? Or maybe they're like, right. Sorry,
go ahead. No, you might know more. You probably know more about this than I do. Yeah.
No, I think another sort of point about Singapore, I was just trying to reflect and think about like the origin story, and part of institutional quality, I'm guessing, is how good are the rules, but also how much trust do people have in the rules that they'll be enforced, right? Mm-hmm. And I wonder if just being a small state at the beginning, just like having a commitment to enforcing and governing well has huge returns in the long term, because like with each cycle that you enforce it, you create this sort of like positive reinforcement effect where now people believe that you'll credibly sort of crack down. If you say no drugs, it really means no drugs, and maybe it's those starting conditions are to that extent pretty hard to do in places where there's more entropy, right? And you can't sort of like it's a little bit like Singaporean government. I think of them a little bit like the Fed doing forward guidance. Like if they say they'll do something, they'll do it, and that reduces the cost of doing it because people believe you'll do it and they'll act.
So, yeah, it's a reminder that a lot of corporations face this too with like quarterly or annual earnings targets, right? Like if you make goals and you achieve them, then people believe you on the things they can't see, right? So if people see with their own eyes that they can trust you on certain promises, then that helps them build trust in the things they can't see, and it helps build their trust in the future. It's possible that overall there's not much evidence that more populous countries are richer or poorer than less populous countries. Size effects, however measured, don't seem to be important. But perhaps there's a sort of startup nation element where some econometrician could run some tests and find that startup nations are more likely to be successful if they start small. Mm. I'm open to that test. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to wait for that. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say we're coming up on time, so we'll have to wait for that test as well as the test of whether our test of Uber surge pricing pro paying millions of dollars to secretaries could solve some of the problems that we see with immigration and its effect or potential effect on institutions. But lots of work for future grad students to dig into there.
Yes, I look forward to reading that work when students work on it.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on that we didn't get to so far before we close out?
No, this has been a great hour. I really appreciated talking with the two of you. Thanks for getting in touch with me.
Oh, likewise.